The former cabinet minister in Nelson Mandela's presidency and a former unionist, he was COSATU's general secretary. That's Jay Naidoo, if you're wondering who I'm talking about. He's penned a very interesting letter, or should I say a very forthright letter to President Cyril Ramaphosa. In it, he points out that the unrest that shook the country recently has been brewing for decades. We're now joined by Jay Naidoo for an in-depth look at the recent state of the nation and where we ought to go from the unrest that we saw in the past week. Mr. Naidoo, thank you very much for making time to talk to us here on Politics Unscripted. I want to go straight into your letter and deal specifically first with the real looters, because you write about these looters, and many people might think we're talking about the people who ransacked shops in the week or so ago. We're talking about the people who are accused of state capture, right? So I want to go straight there and say to you, in that letter, you call for decisive action to be taken against those, both in the public and public spheres, who have facilitated what you call the looting orgy. Now, and you go ahead to mention specific companies, and I'm going to list them here. The CEOs of companies like KPMG, Bain & Company, McKinsey, SAP, and all others involved. That's what you say in that letter. I want to ask you the question, who are the faces, or who were the faces of these companies when the alleged state capture took place? Why don't we know who they are?
Well, that's a job for you all, Toli, to bring that to the public, because often what happens in politics and in business is the foot soldiers get thrown in under the bus. And so here we have a situation where 57 billion, and we're still counting, is known to have been stolen out of public treasuries, whether those are in the state-owned enterprises, whether that's a national or local or provincial governments. We know there are people that are guilty, that have had their hands in the cookie jar. It does not take rocket science to know them. They've been all over the media. In fact, thank God we have an independent media like you all. Otherwise, we would not know the truth, because even with stringent regulation controlling finances and government, like the PFMA and the MFMA, this looting took place. And it took us a decade to come to know of it. So what I want to see, and what the country wants to see, is not just, the sacrificial lambs or paying a fine. I want to see these CEOs and senior executives of these companies and high-ranking officials go to jail, because we will not arrest this impunity that people have, that they think a position and a title and given the trust of our country, that they could do what they want.
Yeah.
And we're not even counting the economic cost of the destruction to important state-owned enterprises like the Escoms and the Transnets of this country that are vital to our economic health.
Yeah.
And we are talking about collusion here between the private sector and banks and the state, high-ranking officials in the state. So no one should be exempt. We want an admission of guilt, an acknowledgement of it, and we want a prosecution, arrest, and we hope a real sentencing of those that have been culpable for this deadly attack on our democracy that has resulted in these past few weeks of violence that we've seen.
I'm glad that you raised the issue of these companies simply having paid fines, some of them, or some, as they have done, which is to pay back some of what clearly they were not entitled to begin with. The reason, Mr. Naidoo, I'm asking for faces is that just as you know who was at the helm of government at the time of the alleged state capture. We need to know and put the faces to these companies so that perhaps we can direct our collective anger, because that face in the public sphere, we know it's former President Jacob Zuma, and where does he sit today? He sits in a jail cell. So many South Africans perhaps will start directing that collective anger towards the real looters, and I emphasize this word of real looters, who have stolen the monies of this country.
Precisely, and I think that that's not rocket science for us to do, to know who these people are, because often these CEOs accommodate that. You know, they work out their reporting cycle in a way that accommodates a fine. They don't pay a cent. The company pays for that, and ultimately it's us who are the consumers of their products that pay for that, because they raise the prices of those products. So I completely concur with you. We want a list of this rogues gallery. You know, a number of them have appeared before the Zondo Commission, and let me say, I want unambiguous support from this government for the Zondo Commission. Raymond Zondo, I know him from the time when he was a young lawyer, fighting alongside us for workers' rights. No one is going to impugn that he is serving some other agenda of white monopoly capital. This is corruption, straight and forthrightly, we must call it. And this corruption involves a person that offers a brown envelope or under the table, and it involves the person that receives it. And the fact that these are Western companies, and some companies now coming from the East, that are internationally benchmarked and supposed to be there, governed by a stringent regime of good governance, they have been implicated. I think, and walk away from this with just paying a fine is not justice.
Yeah.
I think we have to go straight back to the headquarters of these companies and ask for accountability. And that should be done by our government. That should be done by us as citizens.
Yeah. Well, let's talk then about the inspirational leadership that you say the nation is calling for in President Cyril Ramaphosa at a time like this. In the letter, you state the following, that you understand that the president faces, and I want to quote you, challenges on all sides that are aimed at battering his leadership. But nonetheless, you say the nation calls for inspirational leadership on him. In your view, in your honest opinion, who or what is holding the president hostage from fulfilling his mandate?
Well, I think particularly the party. It's the ANC itself. It's the factionalism within the ANC that has robbed this movement that stood for the principles of service, servant leadership, of ethics, of social justice, of human dignity. And we have factions within that ANC that have betrayed that and hold a gun to the president's head. And what I have to say to the president is the majority of South Africans are calling for inspired leadership, are calling for you to take a stand, to cut out and excise this rot that sits not just in the political party that is the ruling party, but also sits in our ship of state. And we need to send a signal unambiguously to the population that you will lead us, and that those that are held responsible, including in the cabinet, who through their negligence could, when the whole of this country anticipated that there was going to be this violence, that were sleeping on the job, that even if you read the newspapers or listened, to Newzroom Afrika, you would know that people were stoking violence on social media. They were not just stoking violence on social media, they were organizing to break all the lockdown restrictions that you, Mr. President, have imposed on this country and that we accept as the law-abiding citizens of this country. And so, if you just had to look at our history, you will know where the flashpoints are. Without even intelligence, you would know where it will be. If you go back to 1984 and the the great strike that was called there, where the violence happened in Pietermaritzburg, where it happened in Durban, where it happened in the East Rand or the West Rand. Our 90s was a repeat of that. You don't need to be intelligent to know what preemptive action you have to take to support security forces and make sure they are properly resourced with all the equipment and the resources that are needed to prevent it escalating into what it did. Violence that has led to deepening racial issues, ethnic issues, tribalism, everything that the ANC does not stand for and never stood for. So we're asking as South Africans is go back to our constitution, uphold the rights of our constitution, which guarantees security and safety to all our citizens, and to act against those haters and race baiters that have created this chaos. To support their sinister agenda. We're asking for that decisive leadership.
And you say that what is holding the president back is the ANC itself. But I want to be slightly more direct, because in the letter, you almost stop short of calling them out, possibly by name, or even putting faces to some of these people. You say they are demagogic and anti-democratic forces whose continued plundering of public resources will lead to a dysfunctional state. If you were to put a name or faces to these so-called anti-democratic forces, who might they be?
No, I think, Collie, this is where I take a stand. That it's not at the end of the day an individual or an event. It's a systemic practice of leadership that has been undermined here continually since Mandela stepped down from power. The centralization of power in the hands of the leader who thinks that he knows more than everyone else in the country. The encouragement, entrenchment of the type of sycophantic, acolytes that surround that leader, and not having opinions that really reflect what the country is feeling or experiencing. And I think that's an undemocratic practice rather than the group of individuals. But we also have to address an underlying sense of entitlement, and that most characterized by that famous slogan, I didn't struggle to be poor. And that's something that we have to go to the crux of. When you are elected into government or into some public position, you are paid a salary. You have to earn that salary. It's not your God-given right to rule over us. And so what we need to do as citizens is to stand up as citizens. It was citizens who liberated this country, not individual leaders. It was citizens who made a Mandela possible. And what I'm saying is that one of the mistakes, including my mistake when we went into government, is to make citizens bystanders, waiting for government to deliver something. And we know today, we will continue waiting for a long time before government does what it's supposed to do. Because the entire system and infrastructure of government has been compromised. It'll take us some time to clean it up. And that's why we need the president to look at what are the alternative channels. What is the most amazing thing of the last 2 weeks, Collie, is that tens of thousands of people stood up and said, not in my name. And they took action to protect their communities, their infrastructure. There are millions of South Africans doing something. But like the interview you just did before, the government sets aside billions to support the economic recovery. But where does it go? It goes to people already privileged, already entitled, already politically connected. It does not reach that woman who's running a tavern in Tembisa. And we need an entire structure that says resources now must be allocated directly into grassroots initiatives where millions of South Africans are doing things. I walk into Soweto and I see these amazing kids with no resources and no support from government, have taken a dump and transformed it into a food garden, and now extending food gardens to deal with feeding people that are indigent. The South Africans are standing up today and saying, we want to do something. We don't want this country to burn in the flames of the last 2 weeks. And so they're reaching across the barricades and saying, let's build a new South Africa,
Yeah.
where we all will do something. And that's the inspirational leadership we need from our president, to say we encourage and commit to supporting the people, rebuilding their lives, supporting the economic recovery, helping people to learn how to grow their own food, making sure they have access to the market, they can sell their products, so that we don't need to sell alcohol and we stand still when the alcohol ban comes in. We've got a vibrant, dynamic, thriving local economy that we can promote, supporting our people doing the things they are doing already without government support.
Yeah.
To grow food or to create businesses or to, an informal sector or the formal sector.
Mr. Naidoo, let's pause there for a moment, because when we return, if indeed the president is being held hostage, first and foremost within his own party, what might be the grievance of these individuals that are holding not just the president hostage, but also the hopes of this nation? And how many can be found in President Ramaphosa's cabinet? We'll talk about that in just a moment. We are in conversation with a former cabinet minister in the Mandela presidency and a former COSATU leader, Jay Naidoo. Mr. Naidoo, thank you very much for staying with us. Let's continue on this path of the few who are holding us back in the country, and some, by the way, whom you say could possibly have inspired what we saw in the past week. Many South Africans will assume that there is a particular grievance, whether political or otherwise. Is it even appropriate to say that these people have a particular grievance, or is there something more to it than we probably know as the general public?
Well, Tori, I think the point is, when you agree to serve in a public position, particularly a cabinet position, you only have one boss, and that's the Constitution, which is the representative of our people. You're not there to serve a party agenda or to serve a sectional agenda or a factional agenda. And if you choose to do that, you should not be in the cabinet. You should not be in the parliament. What is a parliament? What is politics, the architecture of politics design? It's designed to promote unity, to promote nation building, to promote social cohesion, to confront corruption or abuse of power, and to hold account the executive. We don't see that in the politics of our country. We see people in the national parliament causing as much, a fire and pouring fuel on fire rather than settling fuel. Now, the distinction between the time when President Cyril Ramaphosa and I were leading the trade union movement, we would run towards the fire to put it out with calm minds, with steady hands. We didn't run away from the fire, which is what politicians today are doing in this country. And communities are left abandoned. And then the people that are responsible for our safety and security are missing in action. It took days before the police could respond in a proper way, before the army could have been mobilized, when we knew for weeks before that this event would create a social base for the type of violence we saw. And that those people that created the first incident, even if they had a political agenda, would very quickly lose control of the situation. Because the social base of this country is legitimately angry with the pace of delivery, the pace of state capture that has taken away resources, the fact that 75% of young people in our townships today have no jobs, no skills, and unlikely to have a job in their lifetime in the formal sector. The fact that the bloodbath has not just affected the formal sector, but also the informal sector, as your show has been showing. So we have taken a beating. And here we have the opportunity, which we are talking about, KZN, which depends on tourism, which depends on the lifeline of transport, and the ports and the operation of ports and that infrastructure, and which is already got tensions amongst communities, we leave it wide open, and we don't have action from the Minister of Police, the Minister of Intelligence, the Minister of the Armed Forces, and we're days before we can bring the type of intervention for which they are trained. Communities are not trained to defend themselves. So, of course, things go out of hand and people misuse that power, which should be investigated today, and there should be a judicial investigation of this by the Human Rights Commission. So we get to the roots of what really happened in the last 2 weeks. But we have to move on as South Africa.
And that is in specific reference to what people are saying and describing aptly, might I add, as the Phoenix Massacre. Is that what you are referring to, where there has been absent leadership?
Of course, we are talking about that incident, and we're also talking about any incidents of violence, but also the acts of omission or commission by other people, whether that's in the state or whether that's outside the state. This was orchestrated. What the president describes as an insurrectionary movement was orchestrated, and orchestrated as an attack on our democracy. We need to know the truth about this. Who was behind this?
As we edge closer to the end of our conversation, Mr. Naidoo, I want to talk about what you say in the letter is a country at a crossroads. One is leading to a path of self-destruction and some kind of warlordism, akin to what we saw many years ago in the Congo. You write in that letter. And I'd like for you to contrast these two parts, where the one is to prosperity and the other, as I've just described. Who might be leading the one that is going towards destruction? And what are their interests versus that of the nation?
Well, I think that we're at this crossroads, and the person who is democratically elected to lead us is the president of the country, not the president of the ANC, the president of the country. He needs to make us come out of this stronger, because the bulk of people, the vast majority, I would say 99% of the South Africans have stood up and said, not in our name, we don't want to go back to the past. So the people are standing behind him. And then there's a fraction of our society that are disgruntled in many different ways. They're significant. I'm not arguing that they're not. And a lot of the times they have legitimate grievances that people have about delivery, about corruption, about services they're entitled to. But that does not make people stand up and burn things down or go and attack other communities. So if one looks at the people that benefit out of a dysfunctional state, when rules break down, laws break down, when there's impunity, when there's warlordism, like we saw in the 1980s, where there are fiefdoms, where people create paramilitary armies. Well, the only people that really want that type of state and dysfunctionality so they could continue their agenda are the same people that stole in the first place and were implicated in state capture. That's the core of what has created this dilemma. And what we need going forward is people to understand when you go into government, understand you're going there with an obligation, a legal obligation that we have a right constitutionally to expect of people in government to deliver the goods and not enrich yourself. And if you don't want to do that, then don't go into government. And we need today as South Africans, 60 million South Africans to stand up, we've had enough with you. And we have to get back to the situation where we reclaim the power from those that have stolen it and used it and abused it, and make sure we bring us back to the trajectory that Mandela put us on course for, and his generation, that we address the legacy of apartheid, we address the economic apartheid, we address land reform issues, we address hunger, and we address the issue of young people feeling so excluded, marginalized, and abused by our democracy.
Mr. Naidoo, hold that thought. When we return, the way forward, how do we get ourselves out of the state that we are in at the moment? We continue the conversation in a bit. Yes, we are in conversation with former Cabinet Minister and former Unionist Jay Naidoo, who is talking to us about a letter that he's written to the President of our country, Cyril Ramaphosa, an open letter where he's calling for inspirational leadership. Mr. Naidoo, before we conclude the conversation, and in fact, I want to ask of you the question whether the President, what he needs to do to inspire that leadership. But before we get there, would you agree with the observation that the country at the moment faces uncertainty, a crisis of uncertainty? And if you do agree, what might be the reason why we are in a state of uncertainty today?
Well, I think the country does face a very volatile and uncertain time. I mean, the COVID pandemic has fundamentally changed the world we live in. At the same time, the technological and digital revolution is changing the nature of work. So very much what we experience in our generation of work, of collective bargaining, of production is changing because of automation, of artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, 5G printing. I mean, life is changing. Look at how news is done today. So everything is changing, and we're not yet preparing for that new world. So we're living in a world with great uncertainty and an ecological emergency where global warming is having an absolute impact on the way we live our lives, particularly here in Africa. So there are many factors that influence how we have to rethink, re-choreograph, re-co-create a new world that we are living in. That is very different to the old world. So I think this is a unique moment. It should be the most exciting moment. When I walk into townships or villages, I see people doing things. They're growing food. They understand their relationship with the land. They are entrepreneurs that are on this, creating mobile money apps and creating other apps. So the nature of work has changed. So it is uncertain, but it also could be exhilarating. So for that woman that is an entrepreneur today, that is run the tavern in the past, it's like maybe it's become the old video store.
Yeah.
But she's an entrepreneur. How can we support her to become something else? There are millions of people that are entrepreneurial in our society. They just can't get through the front door of these agencies we set up with highly paid individuals who build their white elephant projects all over our townships and country. How do we make sure that money reaches that woman in running a restaurant and tavern in Tembisa, develop a new line of business? How do we take up land reform in the way in which we could take 1 million people into agroecology, regenerative form of agriculture, where we could get the market, the big companies that have suffered because of this violence, the Checkers and the OK Bazaars and the supermarkets, to buy from communities growing food, and we create a supply chain that allows that connection to be made. Now, all of this is not rocket science. I just think we've got to liberate resources of the state and put it directly in communities.
Yeah.
We've got to look at recreating a different way of looking at it. We've got to go back to our experience of the peace accord, when the violence was at the level much higher than it is today. How do we stabilize the country? How do we build a peace secretariat? How do we create peace forums? How do we bring people from the different communities together to work together? And how do we put money into that to create the development initiatives that are not choreographed for some photo opportunity for some politician or some corporate leader? Genuinely, how do we have this conversation today about taking South Africa away from the precipice of a failed state?
Yeah.
And we have the great opportunity today because there are so many people on the ground that want to do something better with their lives.
Well,
they don't want to be dependent on social grants. They want the dignity of labor.
Yeah.
And we have to focus on not promising people jobs, but helping people create their own livelihoods.
Mr. Naidoo, let me ask you then the question about the leadership that you call for in President Cyril Ramaphosa. What does he need to do at a time like this to inspire that leadership? And add to that, can he get away with not rearranging his cabinet after losing so many people in a space of a week? Upwards of 340 people lost as a result of unrest that should have been picked up by our intelligence community.
Well, I can't do the thinking for him. I would very much expect him, and knowing who he is from the past, when we stared down the barrel of the gun with the enemy behind it, and we didn't flinch. And that's what I say in the article, not to flinch. I know he has it in him. But respond to the cries of the nation. We don't want to go back to our past. We don't want to go back to a burning country. We don't want the racial baiting that is happening today, because most communities, in spite of the violence that may have been ethnic or racial, reject this. The majority of people reject it. The greatest gift we've made to the world is what Mandela called, the philosophy of understanding South Africa as a melting pot of the brilliant diversity of the world. There are people here from the north and the south, the east and the west. We're a melting pot, we're a laboratory, and we can demonstrate to the rest of the world that diversity is a strength if we have the courage of political leadership to lead us through this current, imbalance and current chaos.
Does he have what it takes? Because that's the next question. In fact, that's the next segment I'm going to actually be talking about to a group of panelists.
No, they're not just dependent on him. If 60 million South Africans stood up and said, not in our name, politicians respond to that. Because their entire future depends on that, whether it's at the ballot box or whether we're banging down on their doors. So I think that we're at the point which, unlike any other point in our past, there's a definite understanding that the bubble that the middle classes and the affluent have been living in is being pierced and can be pierced again. And next time the consequences are even greater. So it's our obligation to promote good governance and ethics. It's our obligations to get out of our comfort zone and do something. And it'll be millions of small acts of kindness rather than grandiose gestures in corporatist deals done in five-star hotels. We individually have to make a decision that we're going to build our country, and we're going to build it together. And we're going to stop the abuse of power. And that's the only way we're going to change it. That power doesn't just rest in one person or in one entity or in one government. Power is dispersed. And belongs to all of us.
Jay Naidoo, thank you very much for talking to us. Former Cabinet Minister in the Mandela presidency and a former General Secretary of the Congress of South African Trade Unions. That's COSATU. Thanks indeed for your time.